On January 6, 2012, officers walked into a house in Clarksville, Tennessee, where two people had already lost their lives before help could ever reach them. One victim was Derrick Meech Sherden, a young Gangster Disciples associate whose circle stretched across the local streets, while the other was Amanda Weyand, a mother who happened to be inside the wrong room at the worst possible moment. While detectives searched for answers, very few people wanted to speak, which allowed rumors to move faster than facts across Clarksville. As that silence settled over the city, the man accused of pulling the trigger kept gaining influence inside a Gangster Disciples faction operating throughout Middle Tennessee. Long before those killings shook the neighborhood, another story had already been unfolding beneath the surface. To understand how Brandon Durrell Hardison ended up at the center of one of Tennessee's biggest Gangster Disciples investigations, it helps to start with the places that shaped him during the early 2000s. Clarksville was growing quickly during those years, partly through the influence of nearby Fort Campbell, while Nashville continued expanding across surrounding communities filled with workers, students, soldiers, and young families searching for opportunity. Yet, beneath that growth sat another economy operating through apartment complexes, older housing corridors, neighborhood bars, and side streets where drug money moved faster than legitimate paychecks. While college students filled classrooms at Austin Peay State University, gang members were building networks that stretched from Tennessee into Kentucky, eventually linking local neighborhoods to a national organization born hundreds of miles away in Chicago. That organization was the Gangster Disciples, a group whose influence had already spread across numerous states by the time Hardison came around. Leadership structures mirrored a corporation more than a neighborhood crew, which meant local members answered to governors, security chiefs, regional leaders, and regents who controlled operations from above. Within Clarksville, members referred to their local chapter as a DEC, which served as a regional branch responsible for recruitment, discipline, collections, narcotics distribution, and retaliation against rivals. Young recruits entering that environment quickly learned that status rarely came through age alone, since respect usually followed whoever generated money, handled pressure, or proved willing to commit violence when leadership demanded it. As Hardison drifted deeper into that world, he crossed paths with influential figures already holding weight inside the organization. Marcus Darden stood near the top of the regional hierarchy and carried authority throughout parts of Tennessee and Kentucky, while Lamar L. Boogie Warfield supervised security operations and helped enforce internal discipline. Around them operated men such as Morris Burks, who had already earned trust through years of involvement, creating a network of older members whose actions became examples for younger recruits. Hardison paid attention to how these men carried themselves, which gradually pulled him away from ordinary neighborhood life and closer toward the structure governing the Clarksville DEC. Once he officially joined the Gangster Disciples around the mid-2000s, Hardison entered a system built around rules, obligations, and consequences. Members were expected to stay on count, which meant paying dues, attending meetings, memorizing organizational literature, and remaining available whenever leadership called. Missing meetings, refusing orders, or disrespecting superiors could bring severe beatings known as smashings, while more serious violations sometimes resulted in deadly punishment. Through those meetings, younger members absorbed a culture where loyalty outweighed nearly everything else, making cooperation with law enforcement one of the worst offenses imaginable. While those rules created structure, enforcement created fear, which meant ambitious recruits often gained attention through actions rather than words. Hardison started taking part in collections, intimidation efforts, and street-level enforcement assignments designed to protect gang interests throughout Clarksville and nearby communities. Older members trusted him with increasingly sensitive responsibilities, partly because he showed little hesitation when confrontations developed. As that reputation spread, younger members began recognizing his face at meetings and gatherings, while leadership started viewing him as someone capable of handling difficult situations without drawing unnecessary attention. Around the same period, several people entered Hardison's orbit long before their lives became tied together in tragedy. Tavares T.T. Trotter emerged as a close associate who frequently spent time around the same operations and social circles. Derrick Meech Sherden moved within the Gangster Disciples environment while maintaining friendships throughout Clarksville, creating relationships that appeared stable on the surface. Amanda Weyand was building her own life as a mother while remaining connected to people involved in that world. Morris Burks continued climbing within the organization alongside other respected members, creating a network of personalities whose paths would eventually collide in ways none of them could fully anticipate. As Hardison learned the structure governing the Clarksville deck, older members were already teaching him a lesson that would shape nearly every major decision ahead. Since inside that organization, influence rarely came from speeches or titles alone, and usually belonged to whoever proved willing to take things further than everyone else. By the time Brandon Hardison reached the next stage of his Gangster Disciples career, many people around Clarksville knew him by another name. Members called him Creep, a nickname that reflected how he moved through neighborhoods without attracting much attention, even while remaining deeply involved in gang operations. Stories circulated among members describing someone who rarely wasted energy talking when action could accomplish the same objective faster. Whether every story was true hardly mattered, since reputations inside street organizations often become powerful long before facts catch up. That reputation grew alongside the drug economy, supporting the Clarksville deck. Marijuana, crack cocaine, and powder cocaine generated income across multiple communities connected to the organization, creating a constant need for people willing to collect debts, settle disputes, and protect profits. Customers who failed to pay rarely received endless chances, especially when money represented more than cash and became a measure of authority. Hardison increasingly found himself involved in those collections, showing up beside other members whenever somebody delayed payment or challenged the deck's authority. Through repeated encounters, people began associating his presence with consequences rather than conversation. During this period, Tavares T.T. Trotter became one of Hardison's closest companions. The two spent significant time together through drug activity, transportation runs, meetings, and security assignments connected to gang operations. Trotter often served as a driver when members needed to move around Clarksville, Nashville, or nearby communities, creating a partnership built through familiarity and shared exposure to the organization's daily business. As their friendship developed, both men became increasingly involved in assignments requiring discretion, which brought them deeper into the organization's inner workings. Meanwhile, Hardison's circle expanded beyond Trotter. Morris Burks was becoming one of the most feared enforcers within the broader operation, while Marcus Darden continued directing activity from higher levels of leadership. Lamar Warfield remained influential through security responsibilities, creating opportunities for younger members seeking advancement. Hardison developed connections with people like tattoo artist John Duffy, who would later become important for reasons nobody could foresee during those years. Each relationship added another layer to a network that stretched across Tennessee and Kentucky while remaining tied together through gang loyalty. Yet, even as the organization expanded, internal pressures continued building beneath the surface. Rival gangs created constant tension throughout the region, particularly conflicts involving Bloods members whose presence challenged Gangster Disciples' influence in certain areas. Marcus Darden and other senior figures needed younger enforcers capable of protecting territory, maintaining discipline, and responding when violence became part of gang business. Hardison understood those expectations and increasingly volunteered for assignments that other members preferred to avoid. As more responsibilities landed on his shoulders, whispers about previous acts of violence started circulating through meetings, parties, and neighborhood gatherings. Some stories could never be verified, while others gained credibility through repetition among people operating inside the same circles. Leadership paid attention to those rumors, partly because reputation often served as an informal resume within organizations built on intimidation. Before long, Hardison was no longer viewed as simply another member following orders, since he had started moving toward the category reserved for trusted enforcers whose names carried weight throughout the deck. That rise seemed unstoppable from the outside, although nobody involved could predict that the event which would define Brandon Hardison's entire story would not begin with a gang war, a major drug operation, or a battle against rivals, but instead with a dispute over a small marijuana debt that eventually changed everything. By January 2012, Brandon Hardison had already built a reputation that carried weight throughout the Clarksville deck, which made the dispute with Derrick, Meech, Sherden feel different from an ordinary street disagreement. Sherden was not some stranger drifting through the neighborhood, since he spent time around the same circles, knew many of the same people, and had developed friendships with members connected to the Gangster Disciples. Their relationship stretched beyond business, which made the conflict more personal once an $80 marijuana debt entered the picture. While that amount barely registered as serious money inside larger narcotics operations, the argument was no longer about the cash itself after accusations, pride, and disrespect started mixing together. As tensions grew, Hardison became convinced Sherden was avoiding payment, which pushed the situation toward a confrontation that several people would later wish had never happened. On January 6, 2012, Hardison contacted Tavares T.T. Trotter and asked for transportation, leading the two men toward a trip that would later become the centerpiece of a federal murder case. While they traveled toward Sherden's location in Clarksville, the atmosphere inside the vehicle gradually shifted as the conversation focused less on collecting money and more on consequences. Trotter would later recall statements that suggested Hardison was becoming increasingly serious about resolving the dispute through violence if necessary. Sherden, meanwhile, had little reason to expect the day would end differently from countless previous disagreements that had unfolded across the streets. By the time the vehicle arrived, several lives were already moving toward the same location, although none of the people involved fully understood how permanent the consequences would become. Once inside the residence, the discussion quickly returned to the unpaid debt that had been hanging over both men. Hardison demanded payment while Sherden insisted he did not have the money, causing the conversation to grow increasingly hostile as neither side backed away from their position. What began as an argument soon crossed into something far more dangerous when Hardison produced a firearm during the confrontation. Moments later, gunfire erupted inside the home, leaving Derrick Sherden fatally wounded before any opportunity for escape existed. When Trotter entered after hearing the shot, he found Sherden lying dead, transforming what had started as a debt collection into a homicide scene within seconds. Yet another person remained inside the residence, which meant the situation was not over after Sherden fell. Amanda Weyand, a 33-year-old mother of four, had been inside a bedroom while the confrontation unfolded elsewhere in the house. Her connection to Sherden placed her inside the residence that day, although she had nothing to do with the dispute that brought Hardison there. What mattered in that moment was the fact that she had witnessed events capable of identifying the shooter, which immediately transformed her into a liability in Hardison's eyes. After recognizing Amanda's presence, Hardison reportedly ordered Trotter to help bring her out, creating a moment that would haunt everyone involved long afterward. Trotter refused to participate in harming her, which left Hardison to handle the situation himself as he moved toward the bedroom. Amanda never made it out alive. Another gunshot ended her life inside the same residence where Sherden had just been killed, leaving two victims behind within minutes of each other. While one murder stemmed from a personal dispute, the second killing centered on eliminating a witness capable of speaking to investigators. The violence did not end at the house, since attention immediately shifted toward hiding evidence before authorities could begin putting pieces together. Trotter helped dispose of the firearm used during the murders, forcing him deeper into a crime he never expected to witness. The pair traveled toward the Cumberland River, where the weapon disappeared beneath the water in an effort to erase physical evidence connecting anyone to the shootings. Afterward, they separated and returned to their routines, although neither man would ever truly leave that day behind. Hardison later appeared around familiar locations, including Sidelines Bar, acting as though nothing unusual had happened, despite the bodies waiting to be discovered. When police eventually entered the residence, they found two homicide victims and very little cooperation from people connected to the case. Fear spread through Clarksville as words circulated regarding who might be responsible, while the culture of silence surrounding the Gangster Disciples prevented meaningful information from reaching investigators. As detectives searched for answers, Hardison continued moving through gang circles without facing immediate consequences, which allowed rumors to grow almost as quickly as his reputation. Some members were disturbed that a fellow Gangster Disciples associate had been killed, while others viewed the murders through the lens of discipline and authority. What happened next shocked even people familiar with the organization's violent culture, since the double homicide did not damage Hardison's standing inside the deck. Instead, the killings became the foundation for the biggest promotion of his criminal career. Rather than punishing Brandon Hardison for killing Derrick Sherden, influential figures inside the Gangster Disciples treated the murders as proof that he could enforce gang interests without hesitation. Marcus Darden remained one of the most powerful leaders within the regional structure, and his influence helped shape how internal decisions were handled after the killings. While some members quietly questioned whether murdering a fellow associate crossed a line, those concerns never developed into meaningful consequences. Leadership focused less on the victim and more on Hardison's willingness to carry out violence when conflict emerged. That mindset elevated him from a respected enforcer into someone trusted with broader responsibilities across Middle Tennessee. As his authority expanded, Hardison gained entry into the Blackout Squad, an elite enforcement group reserved for members viewed as proven killers within the organization. Membership carried status throughout the Gangster Disciples hierarchy, since Blackout Squad members handled retaliations, punishment missions, and high-risk assignments targeting rivals or internal threats. Around this time, Hardison began embracing the nickname Creeper the Reaper, which reflected the growing fear attached to his reputation both inside and outside gang circles. Younger members saw him as somebody who had climbed rapidly through the ranks, while rivals viewed him as a dangerous figure increasingly involved in violent operations. One of the biggest pressures facing the Clarksville deck involved ongoing conflict with Bloods members operating in the region. That rivalry intensified throughout 2012, leading to retaliatory attacks designed to protect territory and preserve influence. During September 2012, Hardison participated in a shooting targeting a Bloods member's residence, sending a message that disputes would not remain limited to arguments or threats. The attack fit into a larger pattern already developing throughout Tennessee, where rival groups responded to perceived disrespect with escalating violence. Every incident pushed members further toward confrontations that became harder to control. The most notorious operation arrived on November 3, 2012, when tensions involving Bloods members carried Hardison, Morris Burks, Marcus Darden, and Xavier Jenkins towards Sea Ray's nightclub in Clarksville. Earlier conflicts had already created pressure for retaliation, which led members of the Gangster Disciples to assemble with violence clearly on their minds. Once inside the nightclub, an assault targeting Bloods members quickly unfolded, turning a crowded venue into another crime scene connected to the Clarksville deck. During the chaos, Malcolm Wright was shot and killed, while those involved fled before authorities could immediately identify everyone responsible. The killing increased Hardison's standing within the organization, yet each new act of violence also expanded the trail that investigators would eventually follow. By the end of 2012, Brandon Hardison had reached the highest point of his street career, although the murders, shootings, and retaliation surrounding him were beginning to attract attention from people far outside Clarksville who were quietly building a case that would take years to complete. As Brandon Hardison settled into his role as a chief enforcer, the story became much bigger than one man moving through Clarksville streets with growing influence. The Clarksville deck functioned like a regional machine stretching across Tennessee and Kentucky, where meetings, drug trafficking, collections, retaliation, and recruitment all worked together toward the same goal. Members moved between Clarksville, Hopkinsville, Guthrie, Murfreesboro, and Nashville, while leadership maintained control through strict discipline. Every layer of the organization depended on loyalty, which meant violence remained the tool used whenever rules were challenged. While Hardison handled enforcement, dozens of other members were contributing to a pattern of crime that had already been developing for years. Marcus Darden stood near the center of that network as one of the most influential Gangster Disciples leaders in the region, while Morris Burks built his own reputation through shootings and retaliatory attacks. Lamar Warfield remained deeply involved despite no longer holding the same position that Hardison eventually occupied. Elsewhere, Rex Whitlock carried the weight of an earlier homicide connected to a Bloods member in 2007, while Elance Lucas helped extend the organization's reach beyond Clarksville itself. Derrick Kilgore later became connected to an AK-47 drive-by that struck innocent bystanders, while DeCarlos Tidington fired multiple rounds into a vehicle occupied by suspected rivals after a convenience store confrontation spiraled out of control. Although each man followed his own path, every storyline fed into the same criminal structure that federal authorities would eventually target. Throughout these years, shootings, assaults, drug trafficking operations, and retaliatory attacks became part of everyday gang business. Rivalries involving Bloods, vice lords, and other groups repeatedly produced violence, while internal punishments remained equally brutal whenever members violated rules. Hardison supervised meetings where younger recruits were expected to memorize gang literature, pay dues, and prove commitment through increasingly serious tasks. Those unwilling to follow instructions risked beatings, humiliation, or worse outcomes depending on who felt disrespected. As his authority expanded, he became one of the people responsible for maintaining order inside a structure built largely through intimidation. Yet, greater influence brought greater suspicion, which gradually transformed Hardison's lifestyle into something increasingly paranoid. He regularly switched phones, changed locations, and avoided routines that might make him predictable to enemies or law enforcement. Friends noticed growing distrust toward people around him, while rumors circulated that he questioned the loyalty of even longtime associates. Despite those concerns, his reputation continued spreading beyond Tennessee through broader Gangster Disciples connections, reaching into other states. Senior members elsewhere heard stories about the chief enforcer known as Creeper the Reaper, although that growing notoriety created a problem he could not fully see. The higher his reputation rose inside the gang, the more people quietly began speaking to federal investigators. Long before arrests appeared on the horizon, investigators from multiple agencies had already started assembling pieces of a much larger puzzle. The ATF, FBI, Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, Clarksville Police Department, Kentucky State Police, and several other agencies began sharing intelligence tied to years of unsolved violence. What initially looked like separate incidents slowly revealed connections linking murders, narcotics trafficking, assaults, witness intimidation, and gang leadership. Surveillance operations expanded while investigators gathered information from informants, cooperating witnesses, phone records, and undercover work. Rather than focusing on one shooting, authorities were beginning to map an entire organization. One of the most important developments involved Tavares T.T. Trotter, whose life had never fully recovered from January 6, 2012. The memory of Derrick Sherden and Amanda Weyand continued following him, while fear gradually competed with guilt during the years that followed. Eventually, that pressure pushed him toward cooperation, allowing investigators to hear details about events he had carried for a long time. At roughly the same time, tattoo artist John Duffy provided another critical piece after describing conversations in which Hardison allegedly bragged about violent acts. Together, their accounts helped transform rumors circulating through Clarksville into evidence that prosecutors could actually use. As witness statements accumulated, cold cases started reopening across Middle Tennessee. Investigators revisited the murders of Derrick Sherden and Amanda Weyand, while Malcolm Wright's nightclub killing also returned under renewed scrutiny. Earlier shootings and retaliatory attacks involving figures such as Marcus Darden, Morris Burks, Rex Whitlock, Derrick Kilgore, and others were increasingly viewed as parts of the same criminal enterprise. That realization created tension throughout the Clarksville deck as members noticed growing law enforcement attention and began worrying about potential informants. Leadership attempted damage control, yet every new witness created another crack in the wall protecting the organization. Meanwhile, Hardison sensed pressure building around him, which led to constant phone changes, greater caution, and increased awareness of possible surveillance. Despite recognizing that investigators were paying attention, he refused to abandon gang life or distance himself from ongoing activity. The confidence that helped him climb through the ranks also convinced him he could survive the scrutiny gathering around the organization. What he failed to recognize was that federal agents were no longer investigating a single homicide, a nightclub shooting, or one violent enforcer. They were preparing to dismantle an entire criminal enterprise. By 2017, the investigation that had quietly grown across Tennessee and Kentucky was finally ready to move into public view, which led federal prosecutors to unveil a sweeping RICO indictment targeting the Clarksville Gangster Disciples network. Brandon Hardison stood among 12 major defendants named alongside Marcus Darden, Morris Burks, Lamar Warfield, Derrick Kilgore, Elance Lucas, DeCarlos Tidington, Rex Whitlock, Lawrence Mitchell, Lorenzo Brown, Xavier Jenkins, and James Luke. The indictment connected years of murders, drive-bys, narcotics trafficking, assaults, witness intimidation, and racketeering activity into a single conspiracy case. Coordinated arrests followed across multiple locations as federal agents worked with state and local authorities to dismantle leadership throughout the organization. What began years earlier with scattered investigations had now become one of the largest gang prosecutions Middle Tennessee had ever seen. When agents finally arrested Hardison at a motel outside Nashville, they recovered cash, multiple phones, and a firearm, while prosecutors continued assembling evidence tied to crimes stretching back nearly a decade. Men who once attended meetings beside Hardison were now helping explain how the organization operated behind closed doors. The same code of silence that protected the Clarksville deck for years was beginning to collapse from within. As more participants accepted plea deals, pressure steadily shifted toward the remaining defendants who chose to fight the charges at trial. When Hardison's federal trial finally began, prosecutors used witness testimony, gang literature, phone records, and years of investigative work to walk jurors through the structure of the Gangster Disciples. Tavares T.T. Trotter returned to January 6, 2012, describing the ride, the confrontation with Derrick Sherden, the gunfire, Amanda Weyand's death, and the disposal of the weapon afterward. John Duffy followed with testimony about conversations in which Hardison allegedly bragged about violent acts committed during his rise through the organization. Prosecutors also revisited the Blackout Squad, the nightclub violence involving Malcolm Wright, and the broader pattern of racketeering activity connecting Hardison to the Clarksville deck. By the time closing arguments arrived, jurors had heard a story stretching from street-level debt collections to organized criminal activity spanning multiple states. The verdict came back guilty across the major counts, including RICO conspiracy, murder in aid of racketeering, witness murder, firearms violations, and assault-related charges tied to gang activity. In November 2021, Hardison received 2 life sentences plus additional years tied to related offenses, ensuring he would spend the remainder of his life inside federal custody. The man who once enforced gang discipline throughout the Clarksville deck now faced a future where every major decision will be made by somebody else. Today, Brandon Hardison lives inside a federal prison system far removed from the streets where his reputation once carried weight. The authority that once allowed him to direct punishments, organize enforcement actions, and influence younger members disappeared the moment the courtroom doors closed behind him. Former associates scattered across prisons, witness protection programs, or ordinary lives after cooperating with authorities. What remained was a man serving life sentences with no realistic path back to freedom. Outside prison walls, the consequences reached far beyond Hardison himself. Derrick Sherden left behind a young daughter who would grow up without her father, while Amanda Weyand's children lost their mother through violence that had nothing to do with them. Their families carried the burden long after headlines faded, while Clarksville residents spent years watching the fallout from gang activity that had shaped entire neighborhoods. Hundreds of combined years in prison were eventually handed down to members connected to the broader case, removing figures such as Marcus Darden, Morris Burks, Lamar Warfield, Derrick Kilgore, and others from the streets. The Clarksville deck never fully recovered from those losses. Even now, opinions about Hardison remain divided among people familiar with the Gangster Disciples world. Some remember a ruthless enforcer willing to carry out orders without hesitation, while others view him as reckless enough to bring federal attention onto an entire organization. What few dispute is the chain of events connecting an $80 marijuana debt to 2 murders. When people revisit this story, they often return to January 6, 2012, when Derrick Sherden and Amanda Weyand lost their lives inside a Clarksville house, while silence protected the truth for years afterward. Eventually, that silence gave way to testimony. Those testimonies helped expose a criminal network, and the investigation that followed transformed a local double homicide into the downfall of an entire organization.